Thank you for joining us for the Miami Valley Salute to Veterans. I am Cindy LaPointe-Dafler, a volunteer interviewer for the Miami Valley Communications Council. Today, I'll be talking with Bob Daley of Centerville, Ohio, an Army veteran who served from 1955 to 1957. He will tell us the story of his time in the military. Thank you for being here with us today, Bob.
Thank you, Cindy. I'm delighted to be here and talk about the military.
When you went into the military, were you drafted or did you enlist?
No, I graduated from Chaminade in 1951, just as the Korean War was cranking up, and I went to the University of Dayton. At that time, all freshmen and sophomores had to take 2 years of ROTC. I got to finish my sophomore year. If you're going to take the advanced course, you agree to serve 2 years active duty and 6 years in the reserves, and I had no problem with that. But I was anxious to get my college years behind me. So many of our high school chums went off to the Korean War, and I preferred to finish up, and I'm happy to have done it, and I'm happy to have had 2 years active duty and then 6 more years in the reserves.
You chose to join the Army. What drove you to that choice?
Well, it wasn't my choice. The University of Dayton had the only ROTC they had was Army. I think other schools had Air Force and Navy and whatever.
When you went in, what MOS did you have?
Oh,
Specialty.
MOS.
MOS.
1180, guided missile fire control officer.
Gotcha.
And it was a little surprise to me because I was an English major in college, and I got my orders in June of 1955, sent to an anti-aircraft artillery. I had no idea about artillery or aircraft or whatever, and I got to the Fort Bliss, Texas, and they had 2 tracks for the incoming newly commissioned officers. One was 90-millimeter guns left over from the Second World War, and the other was Nike-guided missiles, which were relatively new. And I got assigned to the 90-millimeter guns, and then when I finished the basic training and got my orders, I was assigned to a Nike-guided missile site in Telegraph Hill in New Jersey, and the southern part of the New York Air Defense Command. And maybe 6 or 8 months later, I was assigned to a headquarters battery commander at 80th AAA Group up on Staten Island.
Staten Island.
Mm-hmm.
So where did you take your basic training?
Fort Bliss, Texas.
Fort Bliss, and then your advanced training as well?
No more advanced training there. When I got out of the Army, I was discharged in the fall of 1957 and had 6 years, obligation of 6 years active with the reserves. And I took that very seriously, but there was no place around, no Nike. There were no Nike sites around Dayton for me to do any training, and I got behind in my obligation, and so I arranged to have a leave from the newspaper and applied for the Army Public Information Officer School in New Rochelle, New York. And an interesting point, as my paperwork was going through the Pentagon for being assigned to the school, I was called on a Wednesday from the Pentagon, and they said, we need somebody with the public information background to go on maneuvers outside of the country, and we can't tell you where you would be going, but would you be interested? And I said I would, and I was able to get a leave from the office, and on Friday I drove down to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and Saturday drew equipment and got a round of shots, and on Sunday morning got a second round of shots, and went into an airplane and flew to Incirlik, Turkey, Incirlik Air Base in Turkey, which is where Gary Powers took off from when he went over Russia and got And it was NATO maneuvers were being held in Greece, and I was with the 101st Airborne Division, and they didn't make us jump. Another public information officer guy and I were somehow flown over or driven over somehow to Greece. So we were on ground when the maneuver started, and they had several airplanes, and they had 101st Airborne guys jump out of the airplanes, and as the soldiers were coming down, so were the small trucks and vehicles and equipment. And we were told to lie down on the ground and look up, and if you see a Jeep coming your way, move. And so we were there for 2 weeks, and in fact it was difficult because the wind on the ground was so strong. It was questionable whether they should let the troops jump from the airplanes. And finally, at the last minute, the senior officer made a decision. Yes, let them jump, and they did. And one of the pictures I got was of a paratrooper trying to run on the ground, running after his parachute, trying to crush it so he could get out of it. And there were several young 101st Airborne members were hurt over there from bad backs from bouncing along among the rocks and stones.
Oh my gosh.
But it was obviously it was important that have all the countries from NATO there to witness the maneuvers, and it would be very difficult for the commanding general to say, well, the weather's so bad we can't do it, after having brought a group from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, all the way over to Greece for maneuvers, and then say, oh well, maybe tomorrow. You can't do it. So they jumped it. It was a tough decision, but it was well. I think the people from NATO were happy to see it, and what it did was demonstrate to the Russians that they could move a fighting force from the middle of this country to anywhere in the world within 48 hours. And that's what they did. When we left from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, we flew up to Newfoundland, over to Azores, over to Spain, and into Turkey. And it took a long time. And the airplane that I was on, and the other public information officer, it didn't have seats. It had Jeeps and small trucks and whatever. And their note said there were no seats, but except for the sides, there were canvas sides that fold down from the side, and you could lie down there and sleep, except our shoulders, our arms were so sore from having gotten. We didn't get much sleep on the way over.
Yeah.
But it was an interesting exercise, and I enjoyed it.
I imagine. What did you think about that? How did you feel?
Oh, I felt that I was glad that I was able to do it. The newspaper let me off. I was happy. That was the only foreign experience that I had, and I think it was great. I want to be a part of telling any opponent of the United States or NATO that we're going to push. We're going to push back, and I am happy to have been a part of it. That was one of the highlights in my military career, but I got off track. When I got behind in my, I told you I got behind in my reserve obligation, so I've signed up volunteer to go to the Public Information Officer School. And with that background, I was assigned what they called a mobilization designation. If need be, like in the Berlin call-up or whatever, if there was a call to action, my assignment was to go to the office of the Chief of Information in the Department of the Army in the Pentagon. And I wasn't called up, but if I had been called up, that would have been, my serving in that capacity would have been more to the common good or the cause than my looking at the fire control decisions at the Nike guided missile. We had radar and we could track airplanes. Of course, no Russians came at that time, but all of we got right up to the point where if they were to come, you push the button. I was much better. I could be much better help to the country by being in the Public Information Office than on the guided missiles.
If you're just joining us, this is the Miami Valley Salute to Veterans, and we are talking with Bob Daley of Centerville, Ohio. Bob, did you grow up around here?
I was born in Cleveland and lived in Youngstown. My father had a job in Youngstown. And then back, he worked for General Motors. And when World War II started, no more cars for sale. And he worked for the Federal Reserve Bank in Cleveland at the Lend-Lease financing. And when the war was over, there was no more Lend-Lease, no reason for financing. He had job offers at banks in Columbus and Dayton. He chose to come to Dayton and work at Winters National Bank as a vice president. And so I was in the 8th grade when we moved down. I went through high school and college there, and then went to the Army and came home to work at the newspaper, the Journal-Herald.
Well, when you left home, when you joined the Army and left home, how did you feel about that? Were you uncomfortable with leaving the area, or?
Yeah, let me tell you two things on that. Let me go back. We were in Youngstown, December 7th, 1941, Sunday, and my mother was active with the PTA group from the St. Dominic's Catholic School where we went, and she had a bunch of women in the downstairs in the living room doing their business. My father was upstairs in a bedroom listening to the radio in the afternoon, on Sunday afternoon. And I was 7, 8 years old and had no idea what was going on, but I knew it was serious. And then when we moved to Cleveland, next door neighbors had a high school girl or a high school graduate whose boyfriend was in the military. And at the end of the war, during the war, in Germany, he had been lined up by the Germans with a whole bunch of American soldiers, and they dug a grave, and they lined him up, and they machine gunned him. He fell before the bullets got him. He fell into the graves, and the Germans came around and kicked these soldiers on the ground, and anybody who moved or showed any signs of life would get shot some more. But he was able to survive that. But when he got home and he was coming to see his girlfriend next door to us, he had what would call post-traumatic division, or PTSD, and I thought to myself, boy. That's a tough job, and somebody's got to do it, and we and young men and now women have to do it. And so I knew when I was going, I knew if there's trouble, there'd be a draft, and if there hadn't been a draft, I would have volunteered. But so I didn't. That was an obligation all of us all young men have, and your question suggests some people didn't like it. Okay, when I was in Washington in 1962, the city of the Berlin crisis, John Kennedy, and they called up some reserves, and there was a group from Dayton that was called up and sent to a military post right outside of Washington in Maryland. And so I was working for the Journal in Washington, and I was sent up to see what was going on up there. And it's the first time I had heard there were people that didn't like the idea of having to serve, but I had been through it, and I understood it, and I was on board. But I found some of the young men in this detachment from Dayton were complaining loudly to a newspaper man about having to disrupt their careers and go on active duty. I didn't write about that, but you can tell that that incident has stayed with me. And then, of course, as Vietnam came along, and a lot more people objected to it. But I don't. If you go in the military, you don't have that option. You go in and get the job done. And my only claim is about my military service. I did what they asked me to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Does any instructor or commanding officer in particular stand out in your mind?
Yes, there were two. When I went to the guided missile site first, there was it was one of 4 sites that were, the headquarters was down on the waterfront, but we were up in the hills, and I got to know a little bit the battalion commander. Battalion commander. And when I got moved up to Staten Island, I was a battery commander for the headquarters battery, and the colonel who was in charge of the AAA group, several battalions, and one time there was the company I had, the battery, had a picnic on the camp, on the fort somewhere, and I guess wives and children and whatever, and it was a big deal. And the supply sergeant was moving the hot dogs and Cokes and soft drinks and whatever over to the site, but on the way back, he in his 2.5-ton truck went off on a hilly area. He went off the road, and the truck was backing down into a gully, and he was trying to make it, get the gear shift and the clutch and everything to go back up. He didn't make it, so the truck was left on the bottom of the hill. Next morning, I was summoned to the colonel's office because the military police, the guy in charge of military police on the fort, said he had found this truck, this 2.5-ton truck. He said was found on the fort, and who was responsible for it? And it was a truck that was assigned to my group, and he wanted me held accountable for it to the colonel. And the colonel said, this is what I will never forget. The colonel told his captain, "He's a brand new first lieutenant. Let's let him handle it." And so that's my kind of guy.
That's good.
And then he, when my discharge was coming up, my 2 years active duty, he tried to get me to re-enlist or to stay active. I was anxious to get back to Dayton and back to the newspaper.
Absolutely.
But I would be, and I did my 6 years active duty as a reserve, 6 years as a reservist.
You were not in combat then, combat support?
No combat. I tell you what, it was interesting though, in today's day, you think about all of the internet satellites, all the international, the Chinese balloon coming over, and in those days, Nike sites in defense of an air attack by the Russians, they were all over. There was a set in Cincinnati, and I've been to one in San Francisco. But looking back, the missiles could only go 25 miles. So the Russians, in those days, that was a very expensive project for the United States and for the military. And you look back now, 50 years later or more, and think that, my goodness, all that expense and all that concern about a missile that would go 25 miles. I mean, the Russians would get here before you could engage them at 25 miles.
Absolutely.
Anyway.
Thank you for joining us. If you're just joining us, this is the Miami Valley Salute to Veterans. I'm Cindy Dafler, and we are talking with Bob Daley of Centerville, Ohio, an Army veteran. Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events?
Any unusual?
Or humorous.
Or I'll tell you what I do recall. We first got to New Jersey after my first assignment. It was on out in the country on a hill. But it was so because you could see as far as New York Harbor, and the Indians used to be up there watching the ships come in and out. So it was advantageous for the radar and whatever. But it was too far for me to come home on the weekends. But I was stationed with a guy who lived in Elmira, New York. And we could leave the guided missile site, the battery, at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon and get to Elmira before the bars closed. And so we would go up there on the weekend. Maybe the first time we did it, we got up to the Town Tavern, which was the hangout for the young people. And there were several nurses over there too, and we got acquainted with them. And I got acquainted with one of the nurses, and that was about 6 months or so before they graduated from nursing school. And then a bunch of them came down to New York City to try living the life in the big city, and got a job at the VA hospital. And so one of them was a woman that I had known and I met in Elmira, and when she came down, we dated in New York City. I was on Staten Island, and she was over at the VA hospital on 68th Street. And I tell people we kept the Staten Island ferry in business, going back and forth. And so when my discharge came, and we'd been dating, and I wasn't. I was going to get. I felt I needed to get home and get a job before I even talked to her about marrying. And I came home and got a job, and we got married. And so she came out here, and she's 60. We're going to celebrate our 65th anniversary within a couple of months.
Oh, congratulations!
Well,
That's
anyway.
beautiful.
That's about as no humor. I don't know about any humor. Nothing sticks. What sticks in my mind is that trip to NATO with the NATO maneuvers, and I enjoyed the public information officer school, and I would have enjoyed working at in the Pentagon if there were some kind of an incident.
Yeah.
It would have been.
So you were stationed in Turkey, or you went to Turkey.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get off base at all?
Yes, we did. But the most important thing was to get. We got to the air base and then somehow got over to Greece. And after the maneuvers, there was still a week or so before we had to go back. So we were moved down to a hotel in downtown Istanbul. And one of the things that when I got to the Fort Campbell, Kentucky on the Saturday and got issued equipment and boots and fatigues and a helmet and all that stuff, including an M1 rifle. And that was, we carried that all the time, just like everybody else. And we got to when we got back to Turkey, and we're going from a bus into the hotel or into the building where their office was, and they said we had to be careful because if the Turks see us with rifles going into the building, they would think something is up. the idea of my having to smuggle an M1 from the bus into the office building in downtown Istanbul. In retrospect, that was, but I can understand what they were doing, but it was a long way from a tight spot.
When you were discharged and you came home, did you have an adjustment period to civilian life?
Oh, no. My service was, especially in New Jersey and New York, it was almost like going to college. Except at the Nike site, it was business. Mm-hmm. And I think in this battalion, there were 4 batteries. And at any time, one of the batteries had to be ready to shoot fire within 15 minutes, or maybe even shorter. Maybe one was instantaneously, you had to be ready, and then maybe 2 for 15 minutes, and then one was off for repairs and service. So that was pretty serious business. But when we got up to Staten Island, it was in fact the base that I was, Fort Wadsworth, was right on the Narrows. In fact, it was before they built the Verrazano Narrows Bridge that goes from Staten Island over to Brooklyn. When they built that bridge, after I was there, they took out the building where my office was. But it was, but my battery, my BO cube, officers, bachelor office course, were about 10 miles away at Fort Miller, and so I would go down there and eat somewhere and that's where I lived, and then back up to. So it was not under pressure, not like wartime, mm-hmm. Even though there was live batteries.
When you came out, did you join any veterans organizations?
No, I didn't.
Were you too busy?
I was a newlywed, and I was trying to make it in the newspaper business. I'd always wanted to be in the newspaper business, and fortunately for me, when I went to UD, they didn't have a communications course. So in my first 2 years, I took every writing course, and I worked on the newspaper, whatever I could do writing. Beginning of my junior year, and this was when the University of Dayton basketball team was just coming on the national scene, and the fellow who really built the reputation of the basketball team was Pepper Wilson. He was a sports information director. And someday, early in my September, my junior year, he somehow saw me or called me. He sent me down to see Ritter Collette, who was the sports editor of the Journal-Herald, the morning paper at that time. And he gave me a job as a copy boy in the sports department. I worked there for 2 years. In fact, through the summer after I graduated until I went to Fort Bliss into October. I learned more about newspapers as a copy boy running errands in the sports department than I did. So I was anxious to get back to work, and I was anxious to get settled with my new wife. And I started, of all things, there weren't any jobs in sports when I got back. So I was assigned to what we called Cityside. And my first assignment was to cover Centerville and Washington Township. And when I spoke to for a levy to the city council the other night, I reminded them that in the fall of 1957, there was no Yankee Trace and no City Hall and no Woodburn Library, no Centerville Library, no Benham's Grove, and there wasn't a recreation center, township recreation center.
Bob, is there anything you would like to add that we have not covered?
You asked earlier if I had joined the VFW or any of these other. I had more to do than I could handle. But I supported them, and I take pictures as a hobby. I take pictures for anybody who asks. But I've been taking pictures for the Veterans November 11th and Memorial Day at Stubbs Park, and I see those, and I see those old timers down there now. And now that I'm one of them, and I am happy for their service, and I commend them for their service, and I am happy. I am happy to have served. Wasn't involved at all in the Vietnam era, and I can understand that those guys out over there had trouble when there wasn't much support from home, and I would hedge a little bit. But other than that, we have an obligation. We young people, young men and women, have an obligation to defend our country. And a lot of young men and women from 1800 have done that, and have created the country that we have, and we veterans are happy. Most veterans that I know, everyone I know, is happy to have served.
What would you like people to know or remember from your story?
This is a great country. And we all have an obligation to make it as good as it can be. And one way is military, and another way is to become. When I worked at the Kettering Foundation for 40 years, and their research was a research foundation, not grant giving, and their work was, what does it take to make a democracy work as it should? And one of the things that basically important is that all of us have an obligation to be engaged in the community, engaged in as voters. The simplest thing that we have to do is vote, but there are a lot of other things that we can do to make this country a better place, and that is to become engaged in what in the political public affairs of this country. My service and service of anybody at the Veterans Group, especially at St. Leonard, that's what we all should do.
Bob, thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. We really appreciate it. This is Miami Valley Salute to Veterans. I'm Cindy Dafler, and we've been talking with Bob Daley of Centerville, Ohio. Thank you again, Bob.
Thank you, Cindy. It's a delight.